In the heart of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, a rusted bus stands as a haunting monument. A shrine to a young man who traded a life of privilege for a dream of ultimate freedom. His name was Christopher McCandless, but he called himself Alexander Supertramp. Why did a brilliant scholar with a golden future abandon everything to face the wild alone? And what devastating secret drove him to a fate that would make him both a legend and a warning? This is the story of a soul on fire, burning too brightly to be contained. Welcome to the dark chapters. In the remote, unforgiving expanse of the Alaskan interior, there sits a ghost. An abandoned transit bus that has become a shrine, a tomb, and a warning. It is the final resting place of a young man who walked into the wild, hoping to find himself, only to lose his life in the most desolate way imaginable. His name was Christopher Johnson McCandless. But before he was a symbol debated by thousands, before he was a cautionary tale whispered by adventurers, and before he gave himself the mythic name Alexander Supertramp, he was a child of privilege, a genius misfit, born into a picture-perfect American family. To understand why a young man with a golden future would choose to die alone in a forgotten bus, thousands of miles from anyone who loved him, we must first understand the gilded cage he was so desperate to escape. We have to go back to the beginning, to a pristine suburban home where success was a religion and where a devastating secret poisoned the very roots of his existence. This is the story of how a brilliant young man who was given everything chose to have nothing at all. On the surface, the McCandless family was the embodiment of the American dream. They lived in the affluent suburbs of Annandale, Virginia, a world of manicured lawns and political influence, just a stone's throw from the nation's capital. The father, Walt McCandless, was a brilliant and ferociously ambitious aerospace engineer. He was a top specialist for NASA, a man who helped shape the cutting edge of technology before co-founding a highly profitable consulting firm, Users Systems Incorporated, right from his own home. Alongside him was his wife and business partner, Billy. Together, they were a powerhouse of intellect and drive, having built a world of immense financial security and social standing from the ground up. Into this world of high achievement, in February 1968, Christopher Johnson McCandless was born. He was their golden boy, a child of fierce intelligence and an even fiercer intensity. From a young age, Chris wasn't just smart, he was intellectually voracious. He didn't just read books, he consumed them, inhaling the works of authors who would later become his spiritual guides. Leo Tolstoy, with his radical rejection of wealth and societal status. Henry David Thoreau, with his gospel of transcendentalism and self-reliance. And Jack London, with his raw, romantic, and often brutal tales of survival against the merciless indifference of nature. His teachers saw a prodigy. At W.T. Woodson High School, he earned top grades with ease while also serving as the captain of the cross-country team. But even then, his motivation was profoundly different from his peers. He didn't run to win trophies or for school glory. He pushed himself and his teammates through grueling, almost spiritual exercises he dramatically called road warriors. He framed their agonizing runs not as a sport, but as a righteous battle against what he called the evil of our times, a fight against the dark, unseen forces of conformity and materialism. It was an early, startling glimpse into a mind that saw life not as a game to be won, but as a moral crusade to be waged. His younger sister Karine, who was perhaps the only person on Earth who truly understood the depths of his conviction, remembers a brother who was impossibly stubborn, deeply compassionate, and pathologically honest. He was the kind of person who, even as a teenager, would take his earnings from a summer job and, instead of spending it on himself, would secretly drive into Washington, D.C. He'd use the money to buy dozens of meals for the homeless men and women on the city's grimmest streets. He wouldn't just hand them the food and leave. He would disappear for hours, sitting with them, listening to their stories, treating them not as charity cases, but as equals. Here was the central paradox of Chris McCandless, the genius, a mind sharp enough to conquer any academic challenge put before him, and the misfit, a soul that could not stomach the hypocrisy and spiritual emptiness he saw festering all around him. And the place he saw it most clearly, most painfully, was at his own dinner table. The McCandless household was a pressure cooker of unspoken rules, high expectations, and simmering conflict. Walt, a dominant and controlling patriarch forged in the crucible of the space race, envisioned a clear and prestigious future for his son. A degree from Harvard Law School, followed by a career of influence, wealth, and power. Billy, though more gentle in her demeanor, shared this vision. They had provided Chris with every conceivable advantage: a good home, a fine education, endless financial support, and they expected a return on their investment. But Chris recoiled from their plans as if from a venomous snake. He saw their world, with its relentless focus on money, status, and possessions, as a hollow and meaningless spiritual void. He viewed their attempts to guide his life not as parental love, but as a suffocating attempt to mold him into a product of a society he despised. The arguments were frequent and explosive. They clashed over politics, over money, over his refusal to accept gifts, over the very definition of a successful life. To his parents, Chris's burgeoning idealism was a harmless phase, a youthful rebellion he would eventually outgrow once the realities of the world set in. To Chris, their materialism was a profound moral failing, a phony and plastic existence that he could not and would not be a part of. After graduating from high school in 1986, he took his first real, defiant step toward escape. Instead of a celebratory trip to Europe with his friends, he got into his most prized possession, a beloved, beat-up, second-hand yellow Datsun B210. He then embarked on a solo cross-country Odyssey. For 2 months, he was blissfully untethered, sending cryptic and infrequent postcards home that hinted at a profound internal transformation. It was during this journey, as he met other wanderers and slept under the vast, silent canopy of the stars, that the seed of his great Alaskan adventure likely began to sprout. He had tasted true, unadulterated freedom, and he found it intoxicating. But he wasn't ready to leave for good. Not yet. There was one last role to play in the life of Christopher McCandless, and there was one final, devastating piece of the puzzle to uncover. A family secret so profound it would shatter his world, validate his deepest fears, and solidify his resolve to vanish forever. In the fall of 1986, Chris enrolled at Emory University. On the surface, he was a model student. He sailed through his classes, majoring in the perfect subjects for a budding social critic, history and anthropology. He wrote passionate, well-argued articles for the student newspaper, the Emory Wheel, railing against apartheid in South Africa. He graduated in May of 1990 with a stellar 3.72 GPA, earning him membership in the prestigious Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. The path to Harvard Law was not just clear, it was paved in gold. His parents were ecstatic, relieved. Their son was finally on the right track. They had no idea what was brewing beneath the placid surface. For Chris, college was not a launch pad into the establishment, it was the final checkpoint before his great escape. And during a trip home to Southern California the summer before his senior year, he made a discovery that would serve as the final, violent push out the door. Driven by a nagging sense of unease that had haunted his entire childhood, a feeling that the very foundation of his family was built on something unstable and untrue. Chris began to investigate his father's past. He drove back to the California neighborhood where his father had lived years ago before moving the family to Virginia. He started talking to old neighbors, asking questions. And there, in the quiet suburbs, he unearthed the truth. Before Billy, Walt McCandless had been married to another woman, Marcia, with whom he'd had a family. But his relationship with Billy had begun before his first marriage had ended. For a period of time, Walt had lived a double life, shuttling between 2 homes and 2 families. He had fathered a child with Billy, while he was still legally married to and having children with Marcia. The secret was out. The constant tension, the bitter and unexplained arguments that erupted from nowhere, the indefinable darkness that had loomed over his childhood, it all suddenly made a terrifying, sickening kind of sense. It was never just about disagreements over money or careers. It was, in Chris's eyes, all built on a fundamental, unforgivable lie. His father, the man who demanded perfection and absolute honesty from him, was a bigamist and a liar. His entire family, the unit that was supposed to represent truth and security, was a sham. This discovery was the point of no return. It was the ultimate validation for every cynical thought he'd ever had. It confirmed his darkest suspicions about the absolute phoniness of the adult world. The betrayal was total. From that moment on, his relationship with his parents became a hollow performance. He would go through the motions, he would finish school, he would accept their but inside, Christopher Johnson McCandless was already gone. He was simply waiting for the right moment to finally and completely shed his old skin. May 12, 1990, Emory University graduation day. Walt and Billy watched their brilliant son walk across the stage, a perfect picture of success. They take him out for a celebratory dinner at a fine restaurant, and in a final desperate bid to steer him toward their dream, they offer to buy him a brand new car as a graduation gift. They offer to pay for law school outright. He politely but firmly refuses. He tells them he needs some time to himself, to travel, to live for a while. They see it as a temporary delay. He knows it is a final goodbye. They have no idea that he has already made his final, dramatic move. In an act of ultimate repudiation, Christopher McCandless has taken the remaining $24,000, 0 cents from his college fund. Money his parents had saved, money designated for his future at Harvard, and has secretly donated the entire amount to Oxfam, a charity dedicated to fighting world hunger. He has severed his final financial tie to them. He has burned the last bridge to the ground. A few weeks later, he writes a final, deceptively cheerful note to his sister Karine, the last she will ever receive. He packs a tent, a 10-pound bag of rice, his library of books, and gets into his trusty Datsun. He takes one last look at his life in the rearview mirror. He is no longer Christopher Johnson McCandless, son of Walt and Billy, future lawyer. He has a new name for himself, one he has chosen, one that is truly his: Alexander Supertramp. He is an exile of his own making, a pilgrim on a relentless quest for a truth purer than any he had ever known. The yellow Datsun sped west, a tiny vessel carrying a world of conviction. Behind the wheel, Christopher McCandless was performing an act of self-erasure. With every mile that disappeared under his worn tires, he was shedding the skin of his former life. The son, the scholar, the high achiever, all of it was dissolving into the rearview mirror. Ahead lay only the road and a new name, a name he had chosen for himself. A declaration of intent. Alexander Supertramp. He was a man reborn, baptized in the promise of the American highway. His initial journey was a blur of asphalt and freedom. He drove through the hazy heat of the American South, across the vast, sun-baked plains of Texas, and into the stark, otherworldly beauty of the desert Southwest. For the first time in his life, he was not moving toward a goal set by others. He wasn't on his way to school, or to a job, or to a family gathering. He was simply moving. The destination was not a place, but an idea. A life of absolute liberty, unconstrained by the demands of money, career, or human connection. In late July 1990, he drove into Arizona and the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. The desert landscape was a crucible, a place of extremes that seemed to mirror his own internal state. It was here that his new life would face its first decisive test. A torrential summer monsoon, a violent and sudden act of God, descended upon the desert. A flash flood roared through the canyon where he had parked his car. The Datsun, his last and most beloved material possession, his chariot of freedom, was swamped, its engine drowned and destroyed. For another person, this would have been a disaster, a moment of panic. For Alexander Supertramp, it was a sign. The universe was telling him to go further, to shed the final vestiges of his old world. A car was a tie, a form of security. It was a metal shell that kept him separate from the raw experience he craved. He could have sought help, had the car towed and repaired, but that would have been a retreat, a compromise, and Chris McCandless did not compromise. He stripped the license plates from the car and hid them. He took only what he could carry, a backpack, a tent, his bag of rice, and the books that were his true companions. He left a note on the windshield explaining that the car was abandoned. Then, in a final, dramatic act of liberation, he gathered all of his remaining cash, about $123, into a small pile. He took out a lighter and, without hesitation, set fire to the money. He watched the faces of presidents curl, blacken, and turn to ash. It was more than just an act of defiance. It was a ritual. He was burning his connection to the sick society he had fled, incinerating the very tool it used to control people. From this moment on, he would live by his wits and the kindness of strangers, or not at all. Now truly untethered, a ghost in his own country, he began to walk. With the desert sun beating down on him, he was purified by the heat and hardship. He was a modern-day ascetic, a pilgrim seeking transcendence not in a monastery, but in the wilderness. He hitchhiked, caught rides with truckers and travelers, and slowly made his way north. He was a phantom, leaving almost no trace, deliberately keeping his family in the dark. While his parents in Virginia were growing frantic, hiring a private investigator and desperately trying to understand why their son had vanished, Chris was experiencing a profound sense of peace. He tramped through California and Oregon, working for a brief time on a farm near Carthage, South Dakota, for a man named Wayne Westerberg. Westerberg saw a kid who was fiercely intelligent, a tremendously hard worker, but also painfully private. He gave Alex a job, a place to stay, and a sense of belonging. For a while, it seemed like he might have found a temporary harbor. But the pull of the road and the ultimate goal of Alaska was too strong. He continued to wander, a solitary figure against the vast American landscape. He kayaked down the Colorado River, an audacious and ill-prepared journey that nearly killed him, impulsively paddling all the way into Mexico before being forced back by impassable canals. He lived for weeks at a time with a community of drifters and vagabonds at a place known as the Slabs in the California desert, finding a strange camaraderie among people who, like him, lived on the absolute margins of society. He was a paradox. He craved solitude, yet he had an incredible capacity for connecting with the people he met. There was an intensity and an earnestness about him that drew people in. He would engage in deep, philosophical conversations with strangers, sharing his ideas about life, truth, and the poison of civilization. He charmed the people who gave him rides, the ones who offered him work, the ones who shared a meal with him. A kind, elderly man named Ron Franz took him under his wing, teaching him the craft of leatherworking. Franz, a lonely widower, grew to love Alex like a grandson and even offered to adopt him. It was a genuine offer of family, of connection, of a home. But for Alex, these connections were temporary. A home was a trap. Love was a tether. Each time he felt himself getting too close to someone, he would disappear, often without a goodbye, leaving behind another person, touched by his spirit, but bewildered by his sudden departure. He was on a mission, and nothing, no matter how kind or tempting, could be allowed to divert him from his ultimate destination. Every step he took, every job he worked, every person he met was just a prelude to the main event, his great and final odyssey into the Alaskan wild. Having burned the last of his money and abandoned the last relic of his former life, Alexander Supertramp was now a ghost haunting the sun-bleached highways of the American West. He was utterly free, but his freedom came at a price. He was also utterly vulnerable. He had no safety net, no address, no identity beyond the one he had invented. His existence was reduced to its most elemental form, dependent on the rhythm of the road and the unpredictable charity of strangers. His journey became a patchwork of brief, intense encounters. Each person who picked him up saw something different in the lean, bright-eyed young man. Some saw a lost kid, others a philosopher, and a few, a soul on a sacred quest. He drifted north, working odd jobs that required no paperwork and asked no questions. He cleaned grain elevators in the Dakotas and flipped burgers in Arizona, earning just enough to buy a bag of rice before surrendering once more to the pull of the horizon. One of his most significant stops was the small town of Carthage, South Dakota. Here, he fell in with a man named Wayne Westerberg, the owner of a grain elevator. Westerberg was a gregarious, hard-working man who saw past Alex's youthful intensity and recognized a deep well of intelligence and integrity. He gave Alex a job and, more importantly, a sense of stability, however fleeting. For the first time in his travels, Alex seemed to put down shallow roots. He loved the hard physical labor, the feeling of exhaustion at the end of the day, the simple camaraderie with the other workers. The people of Carthage grew fond of the strange, bookish kid they knew as Alex. He was quiet and kept to himself, but he was a good man, honest and dependable. For a few weeks, it seemed possible that he might stay. But the law caught up with Westerberg for a minor crime, and without his friend and employer, the fragile ties holding Alex to Carthage dissolved. The road called again, louder this time. He sent a final postcard to Westerberg promising to return one day, and then vanished back into the American landscape. He drifted south again, drawn by the warmth. Near the California-Arizona border, he met Jan Burris and her boyfriend Bob, a pair of middle-aged rubber tramps living out of their van. They saw the hunger and loneliness in the boy and took him in. For a short time, he became part of their nomadic family. He helped Jan at her stall at the local flea market, selling used books. He would spend hours engrossed in the volumes, recommending titles to customers, his passion for literature shining through. Jan, whose own son was estranged from her, developed a fierce, maternal affection for Alex. She tried to give him advice, to convince him to call his parents, to warn him of the dangers of his chosen path. He would listen politely, his eyes thoughtful, but his resolve was a wall she could not breach. His past was a locked room, and he held the only key. The most profound of these relationships was with an elderly man named Ronald Franz. When Alex met him near Anza Borrego, Franz was an 80-year-old widower, a retired Army veteran whose wife and only son had been killed by a drunk driver decades earlier. He lived a solitary, quiet life, his days ordered by routine. The arrival of Alex was like a stone tossed into a still pond. The young man's energy, his radical ideas, and his unshakable idealism fascinated the old man. Alex became the son he had lost. He took up residence in Franz's camp, and the two formed an unlikely bond. Alex pushed Franz to live more fully, urging him to leave his dusty apartment and re-engage with the world. He set up a physical training regiment for the old man, making him hike into the hills. In turn, Franz taught Alex the intricate art of leatherworking. Together, they crafted a beautiful, detailed belt that would become a kind of journal for Alex, onto which he would carve symbols and pictograms chronicling his journey. Franz's affection for Alex deepened until he could no longer bear the thought of him leaving. In a moment of raw emotional vulnerability, he asked Alex if he could formally adopt him, to make him his legal grandson. It was the ultimate offer of love, family, and connection. Everything Christopher McCandless had claimed he was running from. Alex was visibly shaken. He deftly sidestepped the offer, telling Franz that they would discuss it when he returned from his next great adventure. But he knew he would not be returning. Alaska was looming, the final mythic destination. It had become more than a place. It was an obsession, the ultimate test of his philosophy. In a long letter to Franz, sent from the road, he revealed the core of his beliefs. He urged the old man to sell his belongings, pack a trailer, and embrace a life of wandering. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure, he wrote. The joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences. It was the last time Ron Franz would ever hear from him. True to Alex's advice, the heartbroken old man did as he was told. He put his possessions in a storage unit, bought a camper, and set up camp on the very spot where he had last seen the boy, waiting for a grandson who would never return. Alexander Supertramp had left another life, altered in his wake, another soul touched by his fire, and then abandoned to the cold. He was now free from all human tethers, ready for the final pilgrimage. He turned his face north, toward the last frontier. After 2 years of wandering, Alexander Supertramp had finally reached the threshold of his great obsession. Alaska. It was the name he had whispered to himself in the desert heat and the prairie cold. It wasn't just a place on a map, it was the final stage, the ultimate crucible for his beliefs. The last frontier would be the proving ground for everything he stood for. Here in the vast, untamed wilderness, he would find out if a man could truly live a life of pure self-reliance, free from the corrupting influence of society. In April of 1992, he hitchhiked north, catching his final rides up the Alaska Highway. His pack was light, too light. It contained a 10-pound bag of rice, a small caliber .22 rifle unsuitable for bringing down large game, a collection of books, and a field guide to edible plants that was tragically incomplete. He had no compass, no proper axe, and his hiking boots weren't waterproof. His confidence, however, was absolute. He believed his intelligence and physical toughness would be enough to overcome any obstacle nature could throw at him. He was a young man walking into a war armed with little more than conviction. On the outskirts of Fairbanks, he was picked up by a man named Jim Gallion. Gallion, an experienced hunter and woodsman, was driving his pickup truck toward Anchorage when he saw the young hitchhiker. He immediately noticed the boy's inadequate gear. The pack looked like it weighed no more than 30 pounds, and the rifle looked like a toy. Gallion started asking questions. Where was he headed? Alex pointed to a faint line on his map. The Stampede Trail. He said he wanted to walk into the wilderness and live off the land for a few months. A knot of concern tightened in Gallion's stomach. He knew the Stampede Trail. He knew how unforgiving that country could be, especially for someone so ill-equipped. The rivers would be running high with spring melt, the bears would be emerging from hibernation, hungry and aggressive, and the mosquitoes would be relentless. He tried to reason with Alex, to warn him. He told him stories of other travelers, even experienced Alaskans, who had gotten into serious trouble in the bush. He offered to drive Alex to Anchorage, to buy him proper gear, a better rifle, waterproof boots, a real compass. Alex politely but firmly refused every offer. He was friendly and articulate, but there was an unshakable certainty in his eyes. He insisted he would be fine, that he didn't need help. He told Gallion he had no interest in things he couldn't fashion with his own hands. Seeing he could not change the young man's mind, Gallion made one last plea. He gave Alex a pair of old rubber work boots he had in his truck and a small lunch his wife had packed for him. Alex reluctantly accepted. As they reached the head of the Stampede Trail, Jim Gallion looked at the smiling, determined boy and felt a deep sense of foreboding. He took a photo of Alex, standing at the edge of the wilderness, a solitary figure brimming with naive hope. It was the last photograph ever taken of him alive. On April 28, 1992, Christopher McCandless walked down the snow-covered trail and disappeared into the wild. For the first few days, his journal entries were filled with a sense of triumph. He had finally made it. The solitude was exhilarating, the landscape majestic. He was living the life he had read about in the books of Jack London and Henry David Thoreau. After a few days of hiking, he stumbled upon a discovery that would become both his salvation and his tomb. An abandoned Fairbanks City Transit bus, number 142, left in a clearing by a long-gone road crew. The bus was a godsend. It was shelter from the relentless rain and the swarms of insects. It was a base camp, a home. He scrawled a triumphant Declaration of Independence on a piece of plywood he found inside. 2 years he walks the earth, a final and greatest adventure, the battle to kill the false being within and victoriously conclude the spiritual revolution. He called the bus. His new life had begun. He established a routine. He spent his days hunting and foraging. His .22 rifle was barely powerful enough, but he managed to shoot squirrels, porcupines, and birds. He read his books, meditated on the beauty around him, and scribbled philosophical notes in the margins of his paperbacks. His journal from this period reflects a state of pure bliss. He felt he had successfully escaped the poison of civilization and found a state of grace. His greatest hunting achievement came when he managed to shoot and kill a moose. It was a massive animal, a bounty of hundreds of pounds of meat that should have sustained him for months. He was ecstatic, but his triumph quickly turned to disaster. He had no idea how to properly preserve that much meat in the wild. Following flawed instructions from a hunter's guide, he tried to smoke the meat, but the Alaskan summer air was too damp. Within days, the flesh was covered in maggots and had begun to rot. He was forced to abandon the carcass to the wolves and scavengers. It was a devastating blow, both physically and psychologically. The wilderness was not a romantic poem. It was an indifferent force, and his ignorance had cost him dearly. The entry in his journal for that day was stark. Maggots, it's all my fault. The magic was beginning to fade. The rotting moose carcass was more than just a loss of food. It was a psychological turning point. The wilderness, which Christopher McCandless had seen as a romantic sanctuary, had revealed its brutal indifference. His journal, once filled with triumphant declarations and meditations on beauty, now took on a more somber tone. The boy who believed he could conquer the world with sheer willpower was now face to face with his own profound ignorance. The magic was not just fading, it was being replaced by a creeping dread. By early July, after more than 2 months in the wild, a crucial shift occurred. The intense desire for solitude began to wane, replaced by a yearning for human connection. He had proven whatever he needed to prove to himself. He was now ready to return to the world, to perhaps tell his story and reconnect with the people he had met, maybe even his family. He packed his meager belongings, left the magic bus, and began the long hike back toward civilization. He felt he had been reborn, that he had killed the false being within. But the wilderness was not finished with him yet. When he reached the bank of the Teklanika River, the small, manageable stream he had easily waded across in the April snow was gone. In its place was a roaring, violent torrent, swollen with the summer melt from the mountain glaciers. It was a churning, impassable wall of water. His arrogance and lack of preparation had finally cornered him. He had no detailed topographical map, an item that would have shown him that a simple hand-operated tramway, used by hunters and park rangers, crossed the gorge less than a mile upstream. Trapped by his own hubris, believing there was no way out, he was forced to turn back. Defeated, he walked back to the one place that was both his shelter and now his prison, the bus. His return marked the beginning of the end. The initial disappointment gave way to a quiet, desperate fight for survival. His journal entries became shorter, more focused on the grim calculus of existence. The small game he had relied on became scarce. He was forced to rely almost entirely on foraging for roots and berries. He grew weaker by the day. The entries record a slow, inexorable decline. Day 100. Made it. But in weakest condition of life, death looms as a serious threat. His body was beginning to consume itself. What delivered the final, fatal blow is a subject of intense debate. For years, the prevailing theory, put forth by author John Krakauer, who immortalized Chris's story, was that he had mistakenly ingested poisonous seeds from the wild sweet pea, which he had misidentified as the edible wild potato. These seeds, the theory went, contained a toxic alkaloid that paralyzed him, preventing him from hunting or gathering food, leading to his slow starvation. His journal entries seem to support this, with mentions of pot, seed, and feeling extremely weak after eating them. However, further scientific analysis has challenged this. Later research suggests it may not have been a case of misidentification, but of something more subtle. It's possible he was eating the seeds of the correct plant, the wild potato, but that these seeds contained a different kind of poison, an amino acid that effectively blocks the body's ability to metabolize nutrients. In this scenario, he could have been eating, but his body was getting no energy from the food. He was starving to death on a full stomach. His final desperate self-portraits, taken with his own camera, show a gaunt, skeletal figure, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, transcendent clarity. He was withering away. Sometime in late July or early August, he tore a page from one of his books, the memoir of Nikolai Gogol. On it, he scribbled a final, desperate plea to any passerby. I need your help. I am in Jace near death and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. He signed it, not with his new name, but with his old one, Chris McCandless. In the end, as death approached, he wanted to be known for who he truly was. His last written words, dated August 12, were not of despair, but of a strange and serene acceptance. I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all. He then crawled into the sleeping bag his mother had sewn for him, a final link to the world he had so violently rejected and surrendered. On September 6, 1992, a group of moose hunters arrived at the bus. They noticed a foul smell and a disturbing SOS note taped to the door. Peeking inside, they found the horrifying sight of a body in a sleeping bag. The authorities were called, and the remains of Christopher McCandless were removed. He had been dead for more than 2 weeks, weighing only 67 pounds. Inside his camera, they found the final, haunting self-portrait. He is emaciated, almost unrecognizable, but he is holding his goodbye note, and on his face is a faint, peaceful smile. The discovery of the body was only the beginning of the story's next chapter, its legacy. For the McCandless family, the news was the culmination of 2 years of agonizing silence. The private investigator they had hired had failed to find him. Now they knew why. The grief was immense, compounded by the anger and confusion over his choices. His sister Karine, who had felt his absence most acutely, flew to Alaska with her half-brother to retrieve Chris's ashes, bringing her brother home one last time. In the years that followed, the story of Christopher McCandless exploded into a cultural phenomenon, largely due to Krakauer's book, Into the Wild, and the subsequent film directed by Sean Penn. The abandoned bus became an iconic and dangerous pilgrimage site, drawing adventurers from all over the world who saw Chris as a romantic hero, a visionary who had dared to live a life of principle. They saw him as a modern-day Thoreau, a symbol of freedom from the shackles of a materialistic world. But for many Alaskans, and for others, the story reads very differently. They see him not as a hero, but as a fool. They see a naive, arrogant young man who came to their state unprepared and paid the ultimate price for his ignorance. They point out that he disrespected the power of the wilderness, that his death was not a tragic accident, but a predictable, almost suicidal outcome. They argue that his story is not one of courage, but of selfishness, a story of the deep and lasting pain he inflicted on the family that loved him. Was he a hero or a fool, an idealist or an egotist? The truth, like Chris himself, is complex and resists easy categorization. He was, without question, brilliant. But he was also reckless. He was deeply compassionate toward strangers, yet seemingly callous toward his own family. He sought truth in the wild, but was ultimately killed by his own lack of knowledge. Perhaps his enduring legacy lies not in providing answers, but in forcing us to ask the questions. What is a good life? What do we owe to ourselves, and what do we owe to others? How much is a person willing to sacrifice for their ideals? The story of Chris McCandless is a testament to the timeless and often dangerous human yearning for a life of meaning and purpose. It is a modern tragedy about a young man who flew too close to the sun, not on wings of wax, but on a dream of absolute freedom. He may have failed in his quest to survive, but his story, in all its beauty and sorrow, continues to burn with a fierce and unforgettable light. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the wild. What do you think? Was Chris McCandless a fearless dreamer or a reckless idealist? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. If you were moved by his story, hit that like button, subscribe for more gripping tales, and ring the bell so you never miss an adventure. Share this video with someone who loves a story that challenges the soul. Until next time, keep chasing your own truth, wherever it may lead.